Faith-based NGO. So you're a missionary. Eh, anong ginagawa mo dito? Hey, can you turn me up a little bit? I was just kidding. I thought it sounded fine. I just wanted to sound cool like hello other rappers. Yeah. Damn. One of the most consequential techniques that American missionaries used in educating and Christianizing Filipinos was teaching their own language, teaching English. This represented a major break from the previous Spanish colonizers and missionaries, as the Spanish friars were very, very reluctant to teach their Castilian Spanish to the local Indios, and they even abhorred the idea of Filipinos being able to speak Castilian. And this is a conflict that Rizal uses as a backdrop to the story he has in El Filibusterismo. And so however we want to view current and even historical dynamics of globalization, especially when we look at the Philippine economy, for better or worse, teaching English meant that a lot of Filipinos learned English.
Go grocery yourself and think about what you're gonna eat every day.
And so even today, English is listed as one of the two national languages here in the Philippines alongside Filipino. Sorry again as a Tagalog for the Tagalog hegemony in Filipino. And so if we look at teaching one's language alongside all the cultural values that are imbued in the language and various other aspects of education, we ended up with this dynamic where cultural values being taught by religious figures, missionaries, were indoctrinated in and justified through religion, further instilling the innate sense of cultural inferiority that Filipinos felt toward foreigners that they experienced with the Spanish. And so if we look at this innovation, if you will, of colonial subjugation, where cultural values were taught through one's own language and through various other aspects of education, we see that because the educators were religious figures or missionaries, these cultural values became intertwined with religious and theological beliefs. And so cultural values began to be indoctrinated in Filipinos through the guise of religion. And so the innate inferiority that had been internalized or at least incepted through the Spanish era of colonialism was further internalized in Filipinos through American colonialism and American colonial Christianity. Many theorists, psychologists, theologians, both in and outside the Philippines, have called this whole process of deeply ingrained and internalized inferiority towards foreigners as the colonial mentality. E.J.R. David's work in post-colonial psychology really does a great job of unpacking and deconstructing and critiquing and even providing ways forward in this conversation of colonial mentality among Filipino Americans in the US. A deep well really exists of many thinkers. I've already named Diesto and Magay, and I can even throw in E.J.R. David as the most contemporary work that I'm aware of in post-colonial psychology that has really been doing so much to articulate this deep and heavy and weighty experience of the colonial mentality in Filipinos. And so using their work, the Diestos, the Magays, the E.J.R. Davids, I've come up with my own very simplified definition of colonial mentality, or CM. And I basically describe it as a simultaneous devaluation of the indigenous self and an overvaluation of the foreign other. Melba Magay, in providing her account of how CM or colonial mentality was really fostered in Filipinos during the American colonial episode, writes that in this particular era of colonialism, missionaries took it upon themselves to be a civilizing force. And so then they were teaching their cultural differences as both ethical and religious truth that instilled a sense of cultural inferiority within the static of colonialism. In other words, because of American missionaries, Filipinos weren't becoming so much Christian as they were becoming American. And so there was much more Americanization than conversion happening among Filipinos. One of the funny anecdotes that Magay provides in her book, Clash of Cultures, was her writing about the missionaries' abhorrence of alcoholic consumption among Filipinos. They were absolutely horrified at how much alcohol that Filipinos were drinking. However, she also cited that Filipino alcoholic consumption has actually been a very indigenous part of our culture, as she cited the welcome ceremony among the Tignians in Abra who passed around a cup of basi. And so really this sort of Puritan aesthetic that was in the religious practice of American Christian Protestant missionaries was pretty blind and didn't have the theology to understand that alcoholic consumption didn't have to automatically be relegated as a quote-unquote sin, and to have this sort of moral normative value placed on it, and instead see it as just another part of cultural practice. I like to use the analogy that these American Protestant Christians came to the Philippines only knowing how to play golf, the widest sport on the face of the earth. You think about if American missionaries just came to the Philippines and they were trying to teach Filipinos the gospel of playing golf, but they come to the Philippines and they see that Filipinos really love playing basketball. They're just playing basketball all the time. You know, we have basketball hoops everywhere. And so it's like these normative statements of saying alcohol drinking is a sin would be like a golf player coming to a game of basketball and saying, hey, y'all are playing golf wrong. You're playing it too fast. You got to slow down. You got to get a golf club like this. Your ball has to be about this big, and you're supposed to hit the ball into that faraway hole. I have no idea why white people love golf so much. But yes, the silliness of a golf player telling basketball players that they're playing the game wrong is like American Christians telling Filipinos that passing around a cup of basi in a welcome ceremony is a sin. And Magay even goes further to write that the rampant spread of alcoholism among Filipino communities is actually more symptomatic of the colonial experience, as individuals are forced to deal with the overwhelming legacies of colonialism in the forms of economic subjugation, systemic poverty, and political corruption. And so really, when we look at this overall conversation of colonial mentality and what that means to be a quote-unquote missionary here in the Philippines, we have to really look at what is the type of Christianity we're bringing as missionaries. Diesto writes about how Filipino Christianity is in of itself colonized Christianity. And I'm going to butcher this term, but he calls our colonized Christianity as inhabiting an altrocephalous theology. That kind of sounds like a disease. And so this altrocephalous theology of colonized Christianity among Filipinos is the embodiment of a compartmentalization of the colonized and indigenous identities that bifurcate spirituality into the Western dualistic nature of head and heart. In other words, much of the Christianity that we have brought as missionaries to the Philippines has only reached the head and has yet to really reach the heart and soul of Filipinos.
Iya, talaga naman.